The concept of the deconstruction can be something of a controversial one in movie circles. Because on the one hand, it's often used to acknowledge something that's wrong or heavily flawed about a notion, character, or plot that's often used in other stories and shows why it shouldn't be used the way it is or what would actually happen should the concepts in question play out in real life. Other times, however, a deconstruction ends up used to tear apart something that people actually like, or may in and of itself be wrong in how it deconstructs it, thus earning it the ire of the audience. But all that being said, there is most definitely a time and place for deconstructions, and as I just went over, sometimes they're even necessary to show why an idea or concept is wrong or not as great as it's made out to be. And today, I'd like to go over one of the best movies to do a deconstruction correctly that I've ever seen. And spoilers will abound for the movie in question. So in case you'd like to watch it for yourself first, you should probably click off this video and come back to it another day. This is the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so just to make things crystal clear first, a story can really try and deconstruct anything the writer wants it to, so long as there's something to deconstruct. It could be characters, character archetypes, settings, ideas, notions, concepts, philosophical ideas, the image something has, and pretty much anything else you can think of. The problem these writers sometimes run into, however, is that they want to deconstruct something without knowing how to properly deconstruct it, which of course can cause the whole narrative to fall apart, or they're trying to deconstruct something that shouldn't be or doesn't need to be deconstructed, which usually causes their story to become quite controversial because people can't decide whether or not it's sending a bad message. But all that being said, when a movie does do a deconstruction correctly, it can send a really effective message to the audience. And that is where we get into the movie I'd like to discuss, which does an absolutely perfect job of deconstructing what it intends to. And that would be the 2011 movie Midnight in Paris. The story of a middle-aged man who's somehow transported back to the 1920s every night and gets to meet his long-dead idols in the flesh. This movie does a really effective job of deconstructing the idea that some people would be happier in another time period. Because a major problem for the main character is that he feels unfulfilled in the present and wishes he could go back to the 1920s, which he believes was the golden age of literature, and get to meet and speak with the genius writers of that time period, such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein. And in the movie, through circumstances that are never explored, he gets his wish. Only, things don't go exactly as you'd expect. Because here's the thing. What Owen Wilson suffers in the movie, it's something that a lot of people suffer from in the real world. They believe they missed the glory days of their passion, or that times were better back when, or wish they could speak with a hero of theirs that's long since dead. But the thing is, until we invent time travel at least, it's not healthy for people to think this way. Because all they'll keep doing is longing for something they can never have, all the while believing they'll never find happiness in the time period that they're actually in. And Midnight in Paris does a great job of showing why that isn't a good way to think. And part of the reason why it works is because it doesn't spend the whole movie trying to get its point across. There is an engaging plot to be had, as well as a few scenes that are really only included to be funny. And when it does finally start doing the deconstructing, it doesn't do it in any of the usual manners. For example, Owen Wilson isn't ultimately shown that the 1920s Paris was actually a horrible place to live in because of primitive technology, no modern medicine, and outdated prejudices. Now, sure, all of those were a legitimate problem in the 1920s, but that's not what the movie falls back on to prove why one should be happy in their own time period. Nor does it get its point across by showing that his heroes were ultimately bad people, not the geniuses he thought them to be, or that the experience of meeting them wasn't as great as he had expected. Quite the contrary, actually. Because not only are his idols portrayed as pretty nice people as well as geniuses, but the movie also doesn't shy away from the fact that getting to meet these people is an awesome experience for him. Sure, maybe he realizes that he was seeing some of them in a bit of an idealized light and that these people were only human too, but he never has a stereotypical don't meet your heroes moment and instead pretty much only benefits from having met them. Now sure, once again it is true that sometimes a person's hero isn't as nice or smart as they believe, but the movie doesn't play into that to get its point across either. Instead, it ultimately sends its message by taking a much more universal approach, because towards the end of the movie, the main character is surprised to learn that the woman from the 1920s that he has a crush on doesn't view the 20s as a cultural golden age, and instead believes that to be the 1890s. And when she gets her wish, just like he got his, they're both surprised to learn that the philosophers of that time period instead believe the Renaissance to be the true cultural golden age and is the place they'd like to be. And it's only after this that the main character finally has an epiphany, which he then tries to explain to her. That when you're living in the present, it never looks glamorous, which is why people always look to the past to find the best moments. Basically, one could be living in a golden age and never know it because it's the present. The final outcome of the period isn't known. The great people haven't been put on a pedestal yet, and the era hasn't been glamorized with the benefit of hindsight. In other words, what he's saying is that the belief in wanting to live in another era comes from glamorization and being disappointed in your own time. But even if you could travel into the past, it would only be a matter of time before you'd become disillusioned and start searching for another glamorized time period to go back to. So in the end, the desire to go back and live in another time comes down to searching for a perfect era that doesn't exist, and not actually because one doesn't like the time they're in. So having realized this, the main character then happily goes back to the present and just decides to make the most of it, totally at peace with both the fact that he lives in the time he does for a reason, and that living in the 1920s wouldn't make him any happier or fix his problems in the long run. Instead, he's just going to live in the moment, as we should all try to do. Now, part of what makes this message so effective is the fact that it doesn't lie to the audience. It doesn't try to say that being able to travel back in time and meet the people you admire wouldn't be a cool experience, or even one that could benefit you. But what it also is saying is that you're unlikely to find long-term fulfillment from it and become disillusioned after a while. And given how human behavior usually works, that is most likely to be true. as well as the fact that the people who lived in these golden ages most likely didn't view their time as such, and instead look back on another era with longing, which does only reinforce the fact that we should all try to find meaning and happiness in our own time instead of chasing a past that may not even exist. And what also helps this message is that it's a very timeless one. For being a movie about time travel, one could watch this movie 500 years from now and still take the same message away from it. Because unlike a lot of other movies that try to deconstruct this idea, the deconstruction doesn't center around one specific time period or individual. As I spoke about at length before, the two default arguments by anybody trying to argue that you don't want to really travel to a past time period is either because that time period wasn't actually a pleasant place to live in, or that the people you'd like to meet weren't actually as great as you believe. But instead of taking that approach, this movie is instead saying that no matter where you want to go or who you want to meet, you'll most likely never find the fulfillment you're actually looking for, and instead eventually go looking to some other time to find it, only to eventually end up disillusioned again and repeat the cycle. And that isn't only a much more load-bearing truth, but it's also one that people, even hundreds of years in the future, will be able to understand. Because again, this movie isn't saying that it's the 1920s or the main character's idols from that period that are the problem, but instead the whole notion that he'd be happier living there instead. That's the idea that's being deconstructed, and it's one that anybody can relate to regardless of the time period or people they'd actually like to visit and meet. Alright, so to put it all very simply, what makes Midnight in Paris such an effective deconstruction is that not only is it saying something that needs to be said, but also in the way it goes about saying it. It makes sure to never let the message take over the story, and when it finally does explain its moral, it does it in a very universal, easy to understand way without ever coming across as being preachy. And what also helps is that it's not merciless in its deconstruction either. As pointed out before, it does freely admit that the idea it's deconstructing would be a cool one, and may even be of benefit, but also doesn't let that get in the way when it's time to explain why it ultimately still isn't worth it. And because it's able to achieve this delicate balance, it's also more likely that the audience will listen when that explanation comes, because it doesn't treat the notion as an entirely bad one to begin with. And that is one pretty important thing that most people seem to forget when trying to explain something to somebody. You can't just tear apart an idea they like and then expect them to listen to you. But because this movie is respectful to that idea, and to a degree even plays it straight, it's much more likely that the audience will be open-minded to hearing what the movie has to say about what's wrong with it as well. So in the end, and as I said at the start, if I had to pick a movie that I would say goes about being a deconstruction absolutely perfectly, I might just have to say Midnight in Paris would be it. Sure, there are of course plenty of other movies I could list that did this job just as well, but I'd still say this has to be one of the best. Because again, it's respectful to what it's trying to deconstruct, doesn't come across as preachy, and is most definitely saying something worth saying in a very universal and timeless way. And honestly, I don't know if there's many people out there that would argue that there's a more effective way of getting a moral across than that. It's everything a deconstructive movie should be, especially in regards to how it explains to the audience why it's trying to deconstruct what it's trying to deconstruct. Because if it can't even do that, then there's no point to it even existing in the first place. Okay, that's everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Midnight in Paris might just be one of the best deconstructive movies out there, especially in how it handles its deconstruction, or have you seen other movies that have done it better? Please let me know in the comments below. And like always, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video. You can feel I've got everything backwards if you want to, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.